In 1984, Ian Sayer, author of Nazi Gold, went on a search for the missing treasure. He describes what happened next at the lakeside village of Einsiedel.
One dark, very dark evening, German soldiers dressed as German officers took it up, led mules all the way along that mountainside there, right up to the top. And when they got to the top, they buried this gold and the currency into a number of different holes right at the top of the mountain there. And there it stayed until the Americans occupied the area.
When the Americans arrived in Einsiedel in 1945, they heard rumors about this missing treasure. One of the Germans who had buried the gold, Colonel Friedrich Rauch, decided to rebury it in the village of Garmisch.
They buried the currency in that garden of that house just over there. It stayed there for some weeks, and then Colonel Rauch came back again with an American and quite a few troops. And he demanded of the people that were in the house that they should hand over the currency, and he specified a particular sum. He gave them 3 weeks to dig all the money out of the garden, and then 3 weeks later he came back, collected it all up and put it in his jeep and headed off down the hill. The last time it was ever seen was in US military custody, and nobody has ever seen it since.
Joseph Pinzel was one of the Germans involved in hiding this gold and remembers revealing part of the hoard to the Americans.
I'd been gossiping to my friends in the guest house that I knew where the gold was hidden. As a result, 2 Americans, probably from their intelligence agency, came to me, and I took them to a place called the Cow Hole up in Einsiedel. A German officer joined us, and we went up the mountain. They took a metal detector. The needle started to move at a place covered by logs. It was a very big hole. One of the Americans went off straight away and came back with 2 lorries which they loaded. It looked like square bricks, like something heavy. Yes, gold. They loaded it onto the lorry, a huge amount.
But when American officials made an inventory of the money, they were disconcerted to find that some $20 million worth of it in gold had disappeared. American and German soldiers may be the culprits. The money has never been recovered. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust are now trying to rebuild their lives and recover the life savings of their dead relatives. What they have found is denial and obstruction. Swiss banks have been involved in one of the most disturbing stories of the aftermath of war. (1945) marked the end of the war in Europe. American soldiers had uncovered some of the stolen treasure in the mountains of southern Germany. In the Kaiserode salt mine, they found gold and cash from the Reichsbank. Wealth stolen by the SS, precious stones, share certificates, and gold teeth from concentration camp victims. They also discovered many stolen cultural treasures, including paintings and sculpture, some of the finest works of the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The amount of recovered gold rose steadily, but it was still just the tip of the iceberg. The reserves of entire countries were still hidden in some Swiss bank accounts. While high-ranking Nazis were still being tried at Nuremberg, the Allies embarked on an investigation into the dealings of Switzerland and its bankers. Assets in both America and Britain were frozen as Swiss banks were searched for forgotten German accounts. Many senior Nazis were sentenced to death at Nuremberg, but no such penalties could be served on the Swiss bank managers who stored their money. Switzerland was, for many years after 1945, a continuing haven of neutrality on the frontier of the Cold War between the capitalist West and the communist East. While Operation Safe Haven, the investigation into the Nazi trafficking of gold, remained in place, the Allies decided to settle with Swiss bank officials. Britain was more keen than America to reach a quick agreement. The country was desperate to raise Swiss bank loans in order to rebuild the many cities that had been severely damaged. The Allies claimed that Swiss banks held $400 million in German gold. After negotiations in Washington, the US and Britain took $60 million in total, and Switzerland kept the rest. It was a gross underestimate of the amount of wealth that actually flowed into Swiss bank accounts from Nazi Germany. It was a very generous settlement from the Swiss point of view. But it was a settlement that did not include the Swiss bank accounts opened by Jews before the war. And when Holocaust victims and their relatives came to retrieve their families' holdings, some Swiss banks became obstructive. To all appearances, it seemed they didn't want the survivors to have the money that was rightfully theirs. The story of Elizabeth Trilling-Groch was typical. During the war, Elizabeth's mother had hidden her in an attic in the Warsaw Ghetto to avoid her capture. She recalls how her mother tried to buy their way out of the ghetto with money held in a Swiss bank account.
Telling the superintendent that she was going to write him a letter, withdrawing 3,000 gold marks. Now, I don't know whether he ever did it, but I know that he denounced her and she was sent to Treblinka.
Elizabeth was rescued by her non-Jewish nanny and cared for by a Polish family. Having survived the war, she went to Switzerland to claim her parents' savings. The bank demanded impossible conditions.
Death certificates, which is sort of so preposterous, and I think so insulting. Surely they knew what was going on.
The banks did know what they were doing. They knew Nazi camps did not provide death certificates for those they had murdered. Even when a Holocaust survivor knew the precise number of the pre-war account, the banks still prevaricated. Stephen Foti, a New Yorker and the son of a Holocaust victim, remembered his father's exact words.
My father told me, listen, I have the account number. You go to the bank and you are going to receive this, whatever you have there. Okay? So I was 100% sure that that's how this works.
His father had anticipated problems, and so he hid the account number in his driving license.
Here are the numbers. Here are 4 numbers.
In one account alone, his father had deposited 18,000 Swiss francs. But still the Swiss bank denied any knowledge of the account. Even when the banks announced the existence of 775 accounts untouched since the war, they refused to publish a list of the names of the holders of these accounts. The banks claimed these strict privacy laws had first been introduced in the 1930s to protect Jewish deposit accounts from the rapacious attentions of the Nazis. But these same laws were being used to deny Jewish families access to their own accounts. It was time to expose this hypocrisy. The cozy world of Swiss banking was about to be blown apart by the intervention of a group of powerful Americans. The secrecy of the Swiss banks would be unable to protect their darkest secret of the war. 1995 marked the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. But many survivors of the Holocaust, the victims and their relatives, still suffered from injustice. For many years, Swiss banks had managed to resist their claims. They needed help urgently. It finally came from a businessman who was chairman of the World Jewish Council. Having heard many stories of justice denied, Edgar Bronfman decided to fly to Bern and confront the banks.
The entire Jewish world is part of my family. And sure, I lost 6 million members of my family, so to speak, in the Holocaust. And the victims, very much in my mind. And the survivors, very much in my mind.
Israel Singer worked with him.
The people who were fighting in World War II were clearly the evil and the good, and the Swiss decided to be neutral in a struggle between evil and good.
They received an icy welcome in Bern, where they were accused of hatching a plot to bring Swiss banks into disrepute. After lengthy negotiations, the bankers announced they had managed to trace some dormant Jewish bank accounts and offered to pay out $32 million, a fraction of the amount deposited in the 1930s.
This is supposed to be the final stop, and here's the money, and take it and behave yourself. What I realized was this is going to be a tough battle.
The Swiss tried to defuse the growing confrontation by setting up their own investigation. In September 1996, Switzerland's lower house of parliament voted for a sweeping and rigorous survey of its financial dealings with Nazi Germany. In New York, Edgar Bronfman gained access to wartime documents showing that Switzerland had colluded with the Nazis. He was delighted to make these public. He also had another weapon. Senator Alphonse D'Amato was chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. D'Amato had joined the fight to open the bank accounts, and he had the power to shut down branches of the Swiss banks on Wall Street. This put serious pressure on the bankers. At a press conference in January 1997, Senator D'Amato unveiled some of the documents which incriminated the banks.
For the first time since our inquiry began last December, we have documents confirming that the Swiss were actively and directly involved in shipping gold for Nazis. These documents show that the Swiss claim of neutrality in World War II was pure nonsense.
He cited wartime American intelligence about Swiss support for the carrying of Nazi gold out of Germany.
In January 1946, we have a memo directed to William Donovan. He was the head of the OSS at that time, which was a predecessor to the CIA. The document indicates that high-level Swiss uncovered trails of 280 truckloads of German gold bars sent from the Swiss to Spain and Portugal between May of 1943 and February 1944. 280 truckloads of gold.
At the same press conference, Ilan Steinberg of the World Jewish Council made it clear where much of this gold had come from.
The gold in those trucks included the gold of wedding rings, the gold from gold watches, and even, as we now know, its most grisly form, the gold teeth literally ripped from the mouths of the death camp victims.
President Clinton himself was prepared to reveal secret wartime files. In the face of such embarrassing and damaging revelations, the stone wall of the Swiss bank's resistance began to crumble. It came close to collapse when Christoph Meili, a bank security guard from Zurich, arrived in America carrying pre-war bank records. He had managed to rescue the documents from being destroyed, but as a result, he was in fear of his life.
Und es sind zwei gewesen, hatten die Blätter aufeinander gelegt und gerollt und hatten die unter meinem Hemd hinein und hatten das einmal in meinen Kasten, meinen Umkleidekasten gebracht. Dann bin ich zurück und habe das Buch von 1920.
Some families of Holocaust survivors engaged lawyers and vowed to sue the Swiss banks for $20 billion. In an interim agreement, the Swiss agreed to pay out $10 million to elderly Jews still living in Eastern Europe. They reasoned that those people had suffered under both the Nazis and the communists. The payment was welcomed, but it was still not enough to quell international pressure. Switzerland's foreign minister, Flavio Cotti, began to feel that pressure.
It's also our task in Switzerland to discuss this period of the Second World War, which was a very, very difficult period for our country, and where we certainly also made mistakes.
In December 1997, representatives from 41 nations met in London for the first international conference devoted to finding the Nazis' gold. Delegates from Poland and Austria laid claim to 5 tons of looted gold held in Allied bank vaults for safekeeping during the war. They declared they would hand over any reclaimed money to a fund for Holocaust survivors. Among the delegates was the US Under-Secretary of State, Stuart Eisenstadt.
And therefore, we call on all concerned here in London and those elsewhere to accelerate the pace and complete their great task before we enter the new millennium. The work of the historical commissions underway in so many countries should be completed by then. The funds which have been established and those which will be established should disperse a generous portion of their contributions to Holocaust survivors by the end of this millennium.
But one of the blackest revelations came when Swiss gold coins were tested for their chemical content. They were found to have a very high level of mercury, 10 times the normal content, which indicated the presence of gold used to fill teeth. A forensic dentist, David Whittaker, thinks the gold has come from fillings taken from the mouths of Jews.
You wouldn't expect to find mercury to any great level in refined gold, gold that's used for bullion or gold that's used for making coinage and so on. So if you're finding, or if someone is finding, fairly high levels of mercury, then there is a possible route, theoretically speaking, in which it could have got there. And one could set the scenario, for example, of gold fillings in a person's mouth, and also some silver amalgam in the same mouth, or indeed in other mouths close by. There is a possibility, I think, of some of that mercury amalgamating, chemically fusing, as it were, to the gold, and therefore becoming part of the bullion.
Threatened with boycotts of and sanctions against branches of Swiss banks in the United States and elsewhere, the Swiss bankers finally agreed to a hugely improved arrangement of $1.25 billion to be paid out over 3 years. On the 18th of August 1998, the news was announced by Senator D'Amato.
I think it brings closure to this matter, and it will bring a measure of justice and help to people who need it, and I'm tremendously pleased.
In the same year, Nazi gold hunter Ian Sayer, with his co-author Douglas Botting, published a new edition of his book. They claim there was a cover-up over American and German theft of Nazi gold in 1945. Sayer calculates the worth of the missing gold in today's values at $4 billion. Some of it, he believes, was used to fund covert operations by the OSS, the antecedent of the CIA.
I have good reason to believe that Nazi gold was being used by American covert operations to obviously to counter the communist threat.
Stung by this criticism, the American State Department set up a commission of historians to examine the controversy. In 2001, the first major payments from the Swiss banks were released. The New York-based group administering the billion-dollar fund sent payments to 35,000 Holocaust survivors in 36 countries. Some of them were given to people used as slave labor by the Nazis. But for many of the people who received the money, it revived bitter memories of wartime anguish, as a Holocaust survivor, Barbara Traub, recalls.
It took a long time, years and years, for the Swiss to even admit that there were those accounts, dormant accounts. But I think that it's better later than never. But there is bitterness in my heart.
After decades of deception, the Swiss banks have finally settled their account with the families of surviving Holocaust victims. But the painstaking investigation has revealed something that defies explanation. How Switzerland, a supposedly neutral country, could make such a Faustian pact with the Nazi devil and be happy to profit from it. Today, it remains one of the bleakest enigmas of the Second World War.